So welcome everyone to the fifth and final seminar on the early literature of COVID-19. The subject of today's talk is the future of COVID storytelling. It's obviously the most speculative of the five talks. And here's how it's going to run. So we're going to have a general introduction to Melissa Fay Greene's models of COVID storytelling, a really fairly abstract way of understanding narrative, but I think one that will help us to sort some of the narratives that we've already looked at and speculate about some of the deficiencies in those narratives to look forward to other kinds of narratives that you might be interested in producing that might redress some of these issues, some of these shortcomings. We'll have a brief recap of last week's class, focusing it through Greene's models, the three graphs that she kind of trots out in her work, and how some narratives tend to fit quite nicely within Greene's model, and other narratives, most of the narratives that engage with questions of race and questions of kind of marginal communities don't fit Greene's narratives at all. The one narrative that does, or at least attempts to do so, is Tommy Orange's The Team. And so we're going to spend some time talking about how that narrative might correspond to Greene's model of the man in the whole, or redemptive narrative. And then we'll have a brief introduction to the Spanish flu, or the great influenza of 1918, 1919, and we'll have a look at its very strange literary afterlife, mostly through this poem by William Carlos Williams called Spring and All, which is from 1923. And then we'll conclude with a discussion of the similarities and differences between COVID as a historical phenomenon and a literary phenomenon, and the Spanish flu, with an eye towards what might be coming next. And that'll be it. So let's begin. So first, a general prelude to the discussion. I wanted to give you, because the subject of today's talk is so incredibly speculative, something to kind of hold on to in the conversation. And that's these strange graphs that Melissa Fay Greene trots out in her Atlantic piece from May 2021. You will not remember COVID the way you think you will. And she, operating in a long line of cultural theorists, is suggesting that the way in which we turn a chaotic series of memories or events into a plot, into a narrative, can help to provide some kind of meaning to the suffering, through the pain, to the trauma of what we've all kind of been experiencing. And she uses a couple different graphs to convey a couple different ways in which plots can provide meaning. The simplest of which is the rags to riches story, or in the case of COVID, more likely scenario where you start in a positive space and you end in an absolute negative space. And you certainly see some stories that resemble this. It throws into relief the importance of endings for providing meaning for those particular stories. But I think the more complicated stories, the ones that we started to talk about in this class, last class period, is the redemptive arc, which is an arc that she characterizes as the man in the whole, taking it from the American novelist Kurt Vonnegut's characterization of stories, the common one being a man is not in a hole, a man falls into a hole, and a man at the end gets out of a hole. I'm going to characterize this as the dominant narrative of kind of utopian visions of COVID in just a second. But then you have this more complicated narrative, the Cinderella story or the Oedipus story, where there are multiple peaks and troughs in a particular character's narrative arc. I think this is actually the arc that we're going to be observing most often when it comes to COVID literature, because it tracks quite nicely with the peaks and troughs of the first and second and third and fourth waves of this pandemic. But just to start out, to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page with Greene's characterization of these kinds of narrative arcs, I want to ask a pretty simple question. I'm not looking for a long extended discussion. I'm just looking for making sure that everybody here kind of is comfortable with these kinds of narrative arcs. There's a story that Greene tells within her nonfiction work, and it's a story of this medical doctor. His name is Alex Anura, and it interpolates the story, which is to say, every so often, Dr. Anura's story will come back in. And given the fact that it's juxtaposed with these other stories, we could ask the question, what type of narrative arc is Alex Anura's story kind of embodying here? As just a kind of recap, if it's been a while since you've read it, so Alex Anura's story, he's a medical doctor. He's a mixed race medical doctor. He has I think a Black father and a white mother, or vice versa. And it's the story of him engaging with his wife, who is pregnant, over the course of the pandemic, and he contracts COVID. Now, we've read a lot of different works in this class. In the 4 classes before this, we read another 2 for today. Leaving aside Tommy Orange's work, which we're going to get to in a second, and William Carlos Williams' poem from Spring and All, how would you characterize the other stories that we've read during this seminar? Do any of them contain arcs that resemble one of the 3 arcs that we see here? And this is just a kind of recap from last week. The most common narrative that Americans are looking for, as Greene suggests, because we want some kind of lesson learned from suffering, is that, and you see this, I think, most clearly with Emily Steinberg's work, Ring the Bells, but also to a certain extent in Rosanna Warren's Naturally, that there's this moment that COVID's terrible, right, in the first wave, and it killed so many people, but it enabled us in some way to experience this kind of collective pause that enables us to rethink our behaviors, our consumer patterns, and our communities. This is the man in the hole arc that you see right here. Here is the start of COVID. At some particular point, though, in the initial lockdown, people start seeing the world in a different way. And so there's a kind of redemptive value to the suffering. But as we also talked about, I think a central absence from this kind of redemptive storyline is the discussion of, or inclusion of, many members of different kinds of marginalized communities who had very different experiences than this utopian kind of redemptive vision of the COVID present and the COVID future. I suggested at the end of last week that I think some important early COVID literature addresses this challenge by building in some of the racial history of the United States that was occurring at the same time. But I also suggested that much more work is necessary to properly tell the stories of people whose experiences of the pandemic were very different than this kind of redemptive arc would lead us to believe. And I want to go to that issue right now and kind of frame it in a slightly different way through Greene here. I think that it's interesting that the stories that we've been engaging with that did include these kind of marginalized communities are the stories that least resemble the kind of narrative arcs of Greene's. If you recall Charles Yu's story Systems, which we began with way back in the first week of this particular seminar, there's a nod to the brutal murder of George Floyd, with Charles Yu's Systems saying, from the perspective of the COVID virus, some of them enjoy breathing as their right, some of them can't breathe. That story, if you recall, ends kind of in the middle. It starts with speculation about Meghan Markle and the English prince. What are they going to do? Are they going to emigrate to Canada, and so on and so forth? And it ends with the same kind of questions, but those questions lead us to have a difficult time assigning a kind of narrative arc to that particular story, in the same way as you can assign a particular narrative arc to Emily Steinberg's story of a kind of redemption in the middle of all of this darkness. I think you see the same thing with Miyakoto's Unobliging Robber, which starts out with a man in poverty and it ends with a man in the very same kind of position. There's no real story arc there. And finally, there are references to, in Brenna Thumler's Sort of Together and Mostly Apart, references to different kinds of marginalized communities, including an image of this woman right here, who is a kind of necessary worker in the midst of the lockdown, but we don't get her story arc at all. We don't get the opportunity to think of her story in the same kind of redemptive way as some of the other stories of the pause. And so I thought, first of all, I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to this as a kind of continuation of the conversation we had last week. But then I wanted to pivot to Tommy Orange. He has this story that I asked you to read for today called The Team. And in that story, as I kind of set up for last time, he's asking some pretty big questions about what are some ways that we could reimagine communities under lockdown or kind of pandemic conditions that resemble some of the redemptive character arcs of, let's say, Steinberg's piece. Is a redemptive arc possible here that would take into account a variety of different types of peoples, be a bit more inclusive than I think some of the other narratives associated with redemption and COVID-19 literature. So just as a kind of quick recap of Orange's story, it starts out where he's kind of remembering what life was like kind of pre-pandemic. And he establishes in that kind of flashback the dominant metaphor of this story, which is the team. And the first element of the team is just a marathon. He pays some money, he joins a running team, but he hates it. He quits the team and starts to think of himself as the team, and really kind of goes inward. And then the pandemic hits right after he runs the marathon. And we get, in terms of that narrative arc of Greene's, a kind of high point moving way down to the very bottom of that graph. And then he starts thinking about, as he's stuck at home with his family, he starts thinking about the possibility of a new way of understanding community. We start moving towards that kind of redemptive plot arc that we saw with Steinberg as well. I think this is one of the more important quotes here, where he's trying to imagine what this community is going to look like while he is once again kind of locked down in his home. And he suggests that within the metaphor of the team, the new team was not running, it wasn't marathons, it was planning meals together and sharing news of the outside. The new team was the new future, which was yet to be decided by individual communities, whether they believed in the number of lives lost and how it related to them. Your new team was made up of frontline workers scanning your groceries and delivering your deliveries. It was made up of your old family, the one that had been broken up for so long it seemed absurd to even think of picking up the pieces, not to mention putting them back together again. So I just have a couple of questions that I would love to get your thoughts on. What's the model of community that's being articulated here? And how does the kind of man in the whole vision of Orange relate to some of the utopian visions of writers that we discussed last week, and how does it depart from them? I don't want to spend too much time on the strange conclusion to Orange's story, but I do want to draw your attention to it because it doesn't, that model of community is a kind of local consideration, a kind of local confederation rather, goes away at the end of this story. And I think Orange is trying to establish, we're trying to kind of situate his story within larger kind of redemptive stories akin to what Steinberg is doing. So things move from like the small conditions of his narrator's home and the kind of immediate environments at the very end of the story to this really, really weird effort to kind of move from the local to the universal here. And I wanted to get your thoughts really briefly on that. The final passage here in this story, it makes the big move from the local to the kind of universal through the second person narrative. You would improve once things seem to improve. Once you got some glimmer of hope from the news, you're watching, something will come, a cure, a drop in numbers, something. You're back at the wall, staring at it, unable to do anything but watch. It was the teamwork being done by the whole new world, all those not directly affected, to watch and wait, to stay put. It would be a marathon, all this isolation, but it was the only way the team could make it. Humans, the whole damn race. Just have a couple, again, I don't want to spend too much time with it, but just a couple questions about this strange move at the end, which I think is, in some respects less successful than his articulation of this local community earlier, but I'd love to get your thoughts on if you think it works. First, how does the narrator's metaphor work here? It is strange that you would characterize teamwork as a bunch of people waiting and watching for something to happen. That's a weird characterization of teamwork, but I'm willing to kind of consider ways in which it might be seen as teamwork to be gathered in isolation in different parts of the world, waiting for something to happen, waiting for a cure or a drop in numbers. And then what I would love to get your thoughts on as well is what is asked of the team here when it comes to community building? All right, how might the uncertainties of what's being asked here reflect on uncertainties or contradictions within this really early moment in COVID history? So we talked about Greene and how her kind of narrative arcs help us to understand, kind of organize the many ways in which COVID stories are told. Move there through Tommy Orange, I think as someone who's attempting to inscribe a particular redemptive or kind of man and whole narrative arc onto I think a more interesting kind of community than the Steinberg kind of entire humanity, but struggling with that a little bit. The other way in which I think a lot of people in very recent months have started to think about the future of COVID storytelling is to look at its closest analog in history, which was the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919. And you'll see at the bottom of the screen here a conversation that I would strongly recommend. I didn't assign it because it's really long, but a conversation that if you're interested in exploring these ideas in your own papers, potential articles and conference papers, you really should check out, because it's a conversation between a number of different historians talking about what is going to come next from a historical perspective. And I think you can do a similar kind of thing with literature. So in 1918 to 1920, the great influenza kills approximately 675,000 Americans, and we're still in the process of kind of dealing with a new wave in the United States right now. We're kind of stuck here at this particular moment. But in 1921, the flu moved from kind of epidemic phase to an endemic phase, and it became what we now know as the seasonal flu of today. This is where we might be relatively soon, I hope. And if we were to speculate out, another 8 years or so, where it might be in like 2030 or 2040, if COVID works in the same way that the Spanish flu has worked, the public discussion of the flu will be muted. And in fact, a lot of historians have made this observation. A lot of literary historians and literary critics have made this observation as well. There's very little public discussion of the Spanish flu after 1920. But references to the Spanish flu are everywhere in private family accounts in various archives. And a lot of historians are starting to dig through those archives to tell different kinds of stories about the Spanish flu. At the same time, I think a lot of literary critics are starting to look at texts that they've read countless times in very different ways. Here's one of them. This is a really commonly taught poem by a great American modernist author named William Carlos Williams, who happened to be a medical doctor as well as a poet. You may have known him from a poem called The Red Wheelbarrow, but this is a poem called Spring and All, or On the Road to the Contagious Hospital, from a larger collection, a really weird collection, also called Spring and All, which has a kind of manifesto. It has a bunch of different poems and speculations that begin with this manifesto about the world ending and the artist remaking it. Peoples have started to return to this poem over the last 2 years because of the first line and because of the date, and reading it in a very different way and teaching it in a very different way. I'm going to go ahead and read the poem. This is from 1923, so roughly 3 years after the Spanish flu had ended its epidemic phase and kind of moved into its endemic phase. But I would love to get your thoughts on these two questions after I finish reading it, and so much more, because I think this is just a beautiful poem. But how might this poem reflect sentiments similar to those of the team, a kind of struggle to articulate what new community is going to emerge out of all of this darkness? And then how would we, rather ruthlessly, if we wanted to characterize it, characterize Williams' poem according to Greene's graphs? So this is William Carlos Williams' Spring and All, the poem that I think is one of the strangest poems I've ever read about spring. By the road to the contagious hospital, under the surge of the blue mottled clouds driven from the northeast, a cold wind. Beyond, the waste of broad, muddy fields, brown with dried weeds, standing and fallen, patches of standing water, the scattering of tall trees. All along the road, the reddish, purplish, forked, upstanding, twiggy stuff of bushes and small trees with dead brown leaves under them, leafless vines, lifeless in appearance, sluggish, dazed, spring approaches. They enter the new world naked, cold, uncertain of all save that they enter. All about them, the cold, familiar wind. Now the grass, tomorrow the stiff curl of wild carrot leaf. One by one, objects are defined. It quickens, clarity, outline of leaf, but now the stark dignity of entrance. Still the profound change has come upon them. Rooted, they grip down and begin to awaken. Now, this is a really weird poem. This is a poem that when I teach it in my Survey of American Literature class before the pandemic, for example, I would say, this is the weirdest spring poem that I've ever read because it does things that you would not expect a spring poem to do. What are some things, before we get into the discussion questions, what are some things about this poem that don't do what a conventional spring poem typically does? What are the dominant themes of a spring poem? We associate spring with rebirth, right? We associate it with the rebirth of the world after a dark winter, right? With the cyclic nature of the natural world and all of its beauty. We also associate it with sexuality and with the kind of starting of new life here. And you certainly get that a little bit. But it starts out by the road to the contagious hospital. And the characterization there of an entire hospital being contagious, I think, certainly didn't draw my attention other than purely thematically until I read this poem in the midst of the kind of early days of the COVID lockdown. This is a poem that a lot of literary critics have started to read just over the last 2 years as a poem about the experiences of living through the Spanish flu. Now, this is 1923. What does rebirth look like here? Does it look effortless? Or if it doesn't look effortless, what is it trying to articulate and having a difficult time articulating? How do you talk about the Spanish flu after so many people have died? And how do you bring new poetry into the world at this incredibly uncertain time, not just because of the Spanish flu, but because of the end of the First World War and the kind of social upheavals associated with it? I think even though this poem doesn't look at all like the Tommy Orange, obviously, I think it's trying to, in some respects, in addition to kind of disagreeing with kind of Eliot's presentation of the world, as trying to articulate a kind of a way to move on in the midst of, again, all of this kind of darkness. An attempt at creating a redemptive arc, but recognizing the difficulty of that. How do you think this example of rebirth might be read within the context of the end of the enormous great influenza? I think what I love about this poem, if you were to read it as in some way relating to the historical record, of the Spanish flu is that it presents a depiction of spring in its ugliness and its uncertainty. It presents the natural world as it presents rebirth as being an uncertain phenomenon that requires a whole lot of work and is incredibly fragile. And I think that, living right now at what I hope is the tail end of, 2 years of a pretty terrible pandemic, I feel, much the same way as this speaker, looking at the kind of fragile world struggling to kind of rebuild itself. Just to kind of, because we're running a little bit short on time, and I do want to set up a couple different ways in which you all out there can think about writing about the literature of COVID through this kind of Spanish flu model. I think even if you're not interested in COVID, I think these will be some things that you want to examine. In roughly 20 roughly 20 years after the Spanish flu just rips through North America, and 20 years after it's gone into its kind of seasonal form, you start to see some work come out, but really not a whole lot. There are only 2 novels written that directly engage with the Spanish flu or the great influenza of 1918, 1919. They're William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows from 1937, which I don't think was read at all until this kind of this new pandemic emerged. But the one that everybody kind of references is Kathleen Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which I think is a beautiful kind of devastating story of avoiding the Spanish flu in the same way that I think a lot of Americans avoided conversations about COVID over the last 2 years. Those are the only 2 novels, and really there's very little in the way of poetry. I referenced T.S. Eliot's Sweeney Among the Nightingales, but that's incredibly oblique. I think William Carlos Williams, if you want to characterize that as a Spanish flu poem, among other kinds of ways you can characterize that poem, the reference is only to On the Road to the Contagious Hospital, then it's over. You get some oblique references to the Spanish flu in this Hemingway story, Natural History of the Dead, and you get it in a really, really oblique form in this very strange thing that Flannery O'Connor's homicidal character, the Misfit, delivers in her most famous short story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, when he says that some people have accused him of killing his daddy, but my daddy died in 1919 of the epidemic flu, and I never had anything to do with it. A really strange reference there. Other than that, you don't get a whole lot of references to the Spanish flu in American literature or most other European literatures for that matter. And historians and literary critics just over the last 2 years have been asking questions about why this, this devastating pandemic did not receive more attention. And is this suggesting, as some literary critics have suggested, that no one's going to remember, no one's going to memorialize the current pandemic that we're all living through? And once again, I hope we're at the end of it. So the suggestions for why this is absent, I think, are really interesting. And I would love to get your thoughts as we move towards the end of this class on what some historians have suggested as the marker for what gets included in history books and what doesn't, and how well that can translate into literary classrooms. There's this famous historian, Thomas Ewing, from that same essay, What Came Next? And he says that the Spanish flu wasn't taught in history courses because it could not be linked to certain kinds of historical change that historians really like and really kind of privilege in their classrooms. He says in this particular exchange, the Spanish flu pandemic had few lasting effects other than killing hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world. Borders remained the same, political ideas were not transformed, and social trajectories were not affected. The deaths of somewhere between 50 and 100 million worldwide appeared part of a broader devastation of war, revolution, and famine, but did not deserve attention as a distinct historical event. So the discussion questions, I don't know how far we're going to get into them. We only have 5 minutes, but I think they're worth considering here. Ewing suggests that, once again, historical moments or events are remembered based upon their ability to shape other events. All right, so we remember a particular historical moment because it still exerts a particular influence in the present, politically, culturally, kind of socially, and so on. What I would love to get your thoughts on, or just to have you think about, is how might this idea be related to Greene's notion of COVID storytelling, which suggests that the end of pandemics in some way kind of provide a kind of ultimate meaning for them. How does this enable us to understand, where COVID might be going, right? Or where it might not be going. How does the early history of COVID-19 resemble this brief account of the Spanish flu, and how does it differ from the Spanish flu? Does COVID, in other words, transform borders, political ideas, social trajectories, or does it not? And if it does that mean it's more likely that COVID literature will kind of endure? Or will COVID literature go the way of literature associated with the Spanish flu, which is popping up obliquely, decades later, but really playing no prominent role in American literature and American culture? And finally, what do you think should be the literary legacy of COVID-19, and which of these stories does your story about COVID most resemble? So a whole bunch of really big questions. They're all kind of focused on what do you think about the legacy of the Spanish flu and its relationship to kind of current speculation on where COVID literature is going. As we move to the end, here's the big kind of conclusions that I wanted to get across for you all. First of all, it's very much an open question. I cannot predict the future. I'm fairly certain that COVID will be remembered in a different way than the Spanish flu, but I can't tell you for certain that that's going to be the case. And I think a lot of that's to do with the fact that we're not at the end yet. So we don't know what kind of meaning our cultures will be providing, and what kind of meanings will coalesce around, and what literature or what COVID means for the world. But as students and teachers of American culture, you and we, I think, have a role to play in determining what, if any, text will be preserved from this present moment. We're the ones who get to decide what gets taught in classrooms. We're the ones who write certain kinds of textbooks, introductions to anthologies, and so on. And I think for that reason, I think it's important for all of us who are all in the process of forming and solidifying and transmitting our own narrative arcs to think seriously about how the arcs of other storytellers might be helpful in terms of what you choose to talk about with respect to this particular moment, what you choose to reinforce, what you choose to minimize, or what you work to alter as we all work through the future a kind of memorialization efforts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you all so much for attending this class and all 5 of the seminars. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I've really gotten Really enjoyed getting to know some of you, really enjoyed all the participation, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you so much, everyone.